I've sat in that chair across from thousands of people over the years, and one thing I've learned is that the truth has a funny way of hiding in plain sight, buried under layers of narrative that people build just to survive the day. People look at a 28-year-old woman sitting on my stage, having walked away from her entire family, and their immediate knee-jerk reaction is to call her selfish, broken, or cold. They see the headline and they judge the heart. But I've learned that when a person burns their own bridge to the ground, it's usually because the structure was already so rotten that it was never safe to cross in the first place. You don't just wake up one morning at 28 and decide to exile yourself from your own bloodline without a reason, and if you think you do, you aren't looking hard enough at the reality of human behavior. Sarah sat across from me, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white, looking less like a daughter who had abandoned her family and more like a soldier who had barely crawled out of an active war zone. When she first reached out to the show, the correspondence was filled with the kind of clinical detachment that people use when they're trying to keep from falling apart. She was the family pariah, the one who left home without a forwarding address, the one who turned off her phone and moved 3 states away to start a life that didn't involve anyone who knew her last name. Her mother called it a betrayal. Her siblings called it abandonment. They painted a picture of a spoiled, entitled young woman who walked away from a loving home because she couldn't handle a little bit of structure. But the moment she walked onto that stage, I saw something entirely different. I saw a woman who had been living in a state of hypervigilance for 2 decades, waiting for a blow that never stopped coming. I don't buy into the rebellious child narrative very often because usually there is a systemic failure beneath it, a pattern of psychological warfare disguised as parenting. In Sarah's case, the story she was told her entire life, and the one her family was still peddling to anyone who would listen, was that she was the problem child, the one who lacked gratitude, the one who broke the family apart. But as I started digging, it wasn't hard to see the blueprint of a family dynamic built on conditional love and psychological manipulation. You see, when a family creates a scapegoat, they need that person to stay broken. They need them to believe that they are the source of all the dysfunction, because if they ever realize the dysfunction is coming from the top down, the whole house of cards collapses. When I look at a situation like this, I look for the shadow work. What was happening in that house when the lights went out? Sarah wasn't just a girl who wanted to be free. She was a girl who had been systematically erased. Her mother, a woman who projected an image of absolute maternal devotion, was, in private, a master of gaslighting. If Sarah did well, she was mocked. If she struggled, she was humiliated. It was a classic double-bind scenario, the kind of psychological trap where no matter what you do, you lose, and because you lose, you start to doubt your own reality. By the time she was 28, she didn't know who she was because she had spent her entire existence being a mirror for her mother's insecurities. She left not because she didn't love them, but because she had to kill the version of herself they had created just to survive. The history of this family, as Sarah described it to me, wasn't a series of unfortunate events, but a carefully curated campaign of psychological attrition. When you hear about these dynamics, people often focus on the big, dramatic explosions, the shouting matches, the broken dishes, but those are the easy things to spot. Real, soul-crushing damage happens in the quiet moments, the whispers, the constant rewriting of history. Sarah told me about how her accomplishments were always treated as threats to the family hierarchy. If she got an A on a paper, it was because the teacher was easy. If she made a friend, it was because she was being manipulative. She was never a person in their eyes. She was a variable to be managed, a problem to be solved. This isn't just about a daughter and a mother, it's about a system that demands total conformity. The father in this scenario was the classic enabler, the man who stood by and watched the erosion of his daughter's spirit because he found it easier to live with a tyrant than to stand up to one. He played the role of the silent observer. And in my experience, that silence is the most deafening form of cruelty. When you are a child and the one person who is supposed to be your safety net refuses to acknowledge the abuse happening right in front of them, you don't just feel alone, you feel insane. You start to question if the abuse is even happening, because if it were, surely someone else would see it, right? That's the genius of gaslighting. It makes you the villain in your own survival story. By the time she reached her mid-20s, Sarah was living a double life. On the outside, she was the difficult daughter who couldn't keep a job or hold down a relationship, which was the label her mother insisted on using. But internally, she was a person held hostage by the constant fear of rejection. Every time she tried to take a step toward independence, the family would tighten the leash. If she moved out, they would have a crisis, an illness, a financial emergency, some manufactured catastrophe that required her immediate presence. It was a cycle of dependency designed to make sure she never realized her own strength. They didn't want her to leave. They wanted her to stay just broken enough to be useful, but not broken enough to be a burden they had to actually care for. I watched her body language as she recounted these moments. She wasn't angry anymore, which is what most people expect when they hear someone talking about their family. She was past anger. She was in that space of profound, hollowed out clarity. Anger is a fire, and it can actually be a sign of life, but she had moved beyond the fire into the ice. She had disconnected because connection had become synonymous with pain. She looked at me, and I could see the question she was too afraid to ask out loud. Was I wrong? Was I the one who ruined everything? It's a devastating place for a person to be, wondering if their own survival instinct was actually an act of malice. The escalation didn't happen overnight, but looking back, the trajectory was as clear as a blueprint. It was a slow-motion car crash that culminated in a single, quiet Tuesday evening. Sarah had been planning her exit for 6 months, a secret life she was building in the shadows while her family continued their performance of normality. They were experts at the public front, the church-going, the community involvement, the perfect family photo on the mantelpiece, but behind those closed doors, the pressure was reaching a critical mass. The breaking point wasn't a fight about money or a disagreement over her life choices. It was a conversation about her own identity that finally shattered the thin veneer of her compliance. Her mother had decided it was time for Sarah to settle down with someone from their own social circle, a man who represented everything Sarah despised about her upbringing. When she refused, the family response was swift and brutal. They didn't just disagree, they launched a character assassination that was designed to make her feel so small, so insignificant, and so utterly unlovable that she would have no choice but to crawl back to their version of reality. They told her she was mentally unstable, that she had been a burden since the day she was born, and that no one in the world would ever truly want her if they knew the real her. They weren't trying to persuade her, they were trying to annihilate her sense of self. That was the moment the switch flipped. She realized that staying meant losing her mind, and leaving meant losing her family. It was a binary choice, one that shouldn't exist in a healthy family, but it was the only one she had. She packed a single suitcase while they were at a dinner party, left her key on the counter, and drove until the sun came up. And then the true escalation began. The harassment started, phone calls, emails, tracking her through shared accounts, involving extended family members to guilt trip her into returning They weren't acting out of love. They were acting out of a need for control. When a narcissist loses their supply, they don't just walk away, they go to war. The chaos that ensued after she left was what eventually brought her to me. Her family had created a narrative so compelling, so filled with manufactured victimhood, that even some of her friends started to doubt her. They were painting her as a wayward, ungrateful child who had abandoned her aging parents. The public pressure was mounting, and the psychological toll was becoming unsustainable. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom anymore, she was fighting for her reputation, her mental health, and the right to exist as a human being separate from their influence. She had been labeled the villain, and she was drowning in the weight of a story she never wrote. I looked at her across the stage, and I decided right then that we were going to stop dancing around the edges of her pain. When I bring people onto this stage, I'm not looking for their rehearsed justifications. I'm looking for the raw, unvarnished truth that they've been hiding even from themselves. I turned to the screen where we had the rest of her family appearing via video link, and the air in the studio changed instantly. The tension wasn't just physical, it was atmospheric. Her mother started in immediately. That practiced saccharine tone of voice that usually hides a jagged blade. She was talking about unconditional love and the pain of a mother's heart, using all the right buzzwords to make herself look like the victim and Sarah like the cold-hearted persecutor. I let her talk for a minute because there's nothing like letting a manipulator keep talking until they trip over their own contradictions. Then I cut in. I didn't shout, but I made sure my voice cut through the noise. I told her, "Ma'am, stop. You're talking about love, but I'm looking at a daughter who is terrified of you. Love isn't a weapon, and it certainly isn't a cage. Why don't you tell me about the night before she left? Tell me exactly what you said to her when she told you she wanted to pursue her own life." The silence that followed was heavy. It was the silence of a person who has suddenly realized their script isn't working anymore. Sarah didn't retreat. For the first time, she looked directly into the camera at her mother. And she didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply stated the facts. She recounted the events, the specific threats, the way her autonomy had been stripped away piece by piece. Her mother tried to gaslight her again, claiming it was all in her head, but I wasn't having it. I leaned forward and said, "We have the documentation, we have the records, and we have a very clear picture of what happened. You can play the victim all you want, but this daughter is an adult, and she is telling you through me that she is done with your version of reality." The confrontation was brutal, but it was necessary. I forced them to acknowledge that the dynamic had shifted, that they no longer had power over her. When I saw the mother's face turn from feigned sadness to cold, calculated rage, that was the breakthrough. It wasn't a warm, fuzzy reconciliation moment where everyone hugs it out. It was a moment of absolute clinical truth. Sarah saw it too. She realized that her mother wasn't going to change, wasn't going to apologize, and wasn't even going to acknowledge the damage. And in that moment, the look on Sarah's face changed from terror to something else: liberation. She stopped looking for their approval because she finally saw it for the poisonous thing it actually was. The aftermath of that confrontation was not the cinematic resolution the audience probably wanted, but it was the profound reality that I have come to respect. There was no tearful embrace in the hallway, no sudden epiphany where the parents realized the error of their ways and begged for forgiveness. Change is not a switch you flip. It is a long, arduous process that requires a level of self-awareness that these parents, in their entrenched patterns, were simply not capable of demonstrating. As the camera stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, I sat with Sarah in the quiet of the green room, and we talked about what comes next. The goal was never to force a reconciliation that would only lead to further trauma. The goal was to validate her reality so she could stop questioning her own sanity. She left the studio that day as a different person. Not because she was fixed, but because she was finally authorized to exist as an independent entity. She understood now that she didn't need her mother's permission to live, and she didn't need her father's validation to be worthy of space in this world. The hardest part of the journey was over, but the work of reconstruction was just beginning. You see, when you've spent 28 years being told you're nothing, you don't just wake up the next morning feeling like a king or queen. You have to learn to retrain your own internal monologue. You have to catch yourself every time you start to hear their voices in your head whispering that you're ungrateful or dramatic or wrong. That takes time, and it takes the kind of discipline that most people aren't willing to put in. I watched her navigate the following months. She had to set boundaries that were as firm as iron because, predictably, the family tried to reach out. They tried the guilt route, then the emergency route, then the we've changed route. Each time, Sarah held the line. She wasn't doing it out of malice, she was doing it for self-preservation. When you have a toxic environment that has been the air you breathe for your entire life, you cannot simply go back and visit without having your lungs filled with poison again. She learned the difference between a boundary and a wall. A wall is meant to block people out, but a boundary is meant to protect your inner peace. She built those boundaries, not to punish her parents, but to protect her future. I remember getting an update from her about 6 months later. She had moved, changed her career path to something she was actually passionate about, and, more importantly, she had started to cultivate relationships that weren't built on a foundation of performance. She was learning what it felt like to be loved for who she was, rather than what she could provide or how well she could fit into a predetermined mold. It was beautiful to witness, in the way a gardener witnesses a plant finally finding its way toward the sun after being kept in a dark basement. She wasn't perfect, she still had moments of doubt, and she still felt the sting of that lost connection sometimes, but she was whole. The path forward for Sarah was not a straight line. And I made sure she understood that from the very start. People think that once you cut ties with toxic family members, the happily ever after part kicks in. But that's a fairy tale for children. The reality is that once you remove the primary source of your trauma, you are left with a massive, quiet vacuum where their influence used to be. It's scary, it's lonely, and for many people, the silence of a healthy life feels like a threat because they've been conditioned to equate chaos with intimacy. Sarah had to learn that the absence of shouting didn't mean she was about to be abandoned. It meant she was finally safe. She had to rewire her nervous system to accept peace, which for someone raised in a war zone of psychological manipulation is one of the most difficult things a human being can do. I watched her progress over the following year, and what stood out was her ability to sit with discomfort without trying to fix it or run from it. She stopped apologizing for existing. That was the most significant shift. When we first met, she was constantly shrinking, looking for a way to justify her presence in the room, expecting me to eventually turn on her just like her mother would have. But she stopped that. She started speaking in declarative sentences instead of questions. She stopped looking at the floor when she talked about her future. These sound like small things, but in the world of mental health, they are monumental shifts in power. She was no longer a subject in her parents' narrative. She was the author of her own. She began to build a family of choice, which is a concept I've always been a big proponent of. You don't get to pick your blood, but you sure as hell get to pick your people. She found friends who saw her for her character rather than her utility. She built a career that demanded she use her own voice rather than silencing it to appease a superior. And in every one of these new relationships, she brought a level of radical honesty that scared some people away but drew the right ones closer. She realized that by being her authentic self, she acted as a filter. People who needed her to be small couldn't stand to be around her anymore, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Her parents, meanwhile, continued their pattern. They reached out periodically, usually with emergencies that were transparently designed to bait her back into the cycle. Each time, Sarah didn't react with anger or a long, drawn-out explanation. She didn't owe them a monologue about why she was doing what she was doing. She simply maintained the boundary. "I'm not available for this," she would say, and then she would hang up. That wasn't cold. It was the ultimate act of self-love. It was the moment she stopped trying to make them understand, because she finally realized that they didn't want to understand. They wanted to control. And once she stopped feeding the machine eventually had to move on to find someone else to consume. The final stretch of her journey was perhaps the most telling. It wasn't marked by some grand, triumphant event, but by a series of quiet, steady decisions that cemented her independence. I remember talking to her one last time before we wrapped up our follow-up segment, and she had this look of genuine calm, a look you can't fake, because it comes from the marrow of your bones. She wasn't holding on to the trauma anymore, not because she had forgotten it, but because she had integrated it into her story without letting it be the defining chapter. She had turned the pain into a map, and she was no longer getting lost in the woods she had grown up in. There's a lesson in this that I hope anyone watching or reading this takes to heart. You do not have a duty to sacrifice your soul just to keep the peace in a broken home. People love to talk about blood is thicker than water, but they conveniently forget the rest of the proverb that the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. Your family of choice, the people who actually see you, value you, and challenge you to grow, often carries more weight than the people who share your DNA but not your vision of a healthy life. Sarah had discovered that. She had found that the capacity for deep, meaningful connection was always within her. It was just being blocked by the people who insisted she didn't deserve it. Some might look at her life now, the modest apartment, the quiet circle of friends, the job she truly enjoys, and think she's missed out on something, maybe a traditional family life. But I see something very different. I see a woman who is living in high definition while others are still operating in the gray, blurry haze of familial obligation. She is present. She is accountable for her own life. When she makes a mistake, she owns it, and when she succeeds, she celebrates it, all without needing a performance review from people who were never really rooting for her in the first place. That is the definition of maturity. That is what it means to be an adult. I look at the hundreds of cases I handle every year, and Sarah's is the one I find myself returning to whenever I need a reminder of what the human spirit is capable of enduring and, more importantly, what it's capable of overcoming. She was the scapegoat, the one labeled difficult, the one everyone in her circle dismissed as the problem. And yet, she was the only one with the courage to call the bluff. She was the only one brave enough to look at a life built on lies and choose to burn it down so that she could build something honest on the ashes. That's not betrayal. That's survival in its purest form. It takes a long time to realize that you aren't the villain in your own story, even when everyone you know is screaming it at you. It takes even longer to stop believing the lies you were told about your own limitations. But once you break that seal, once you really understand that you are the architect of your own peace, you become dangerous not to others, but to the toxic structures that depend on your silence. Sarah walked away from a life that was killing her, and in doing so, She found the life she was meant to live all along. That is the ultimate success story, and I'm proud of her for having the backbone to see it through to the end.